G'day, welcome to another episode of Country Life on the Coast. My name is Sean, and on today's episode we're going to look at how to build a jig to do these cutouts of the top rails of a fence. So when I did my fencing project, I did this post and rail construction. I used 100mm CCA copper logs for the post and the top rail. I did this cutout here for the top rail to sit on the post. And because I was doing it everywhere and I wanted to make them consistent, that's why I made up this jig. And so we'll go and have a closer look at this, how I built it, so that you can build your own. So I've got this rail here, which we can see that the cutout has been done. And so this was what I had to do to cut a heap of these out, making it consistent. That's why I made a jig for myself to make it easier. So because the post is 100mm wide, we obviously want to take 50mm off here each time. And then I decided I'd cut through half of this post as well. Now you can set this up whichever way you like. But the idea, the way the jig works, if you haven't seen my videos, is that so the rail will slide in like that, and then I just use my circular saw. And what I've got is this piece of timber here is slightly higher than this one, so that I can just, actually, I'll grab my saw and show you. So what I would do is have this on the ground, and I'd be standing up on it just to hold this and support it. But basically my saw would run along like that, and that would be the cut. So this edge of the saw will run along this straight edge here, and that will give me this cut. So what we have is we have a stop here, so that as you slide the rail in, it will just slide all the way home to there. And then, like I said, the saw will use this as a stop to cut it. And then the only bit that was a bit trickier was I used this piece of timber as a stop to do this cut. You just need to make sure that it's sitting obviously the right way you want. And then the saw would sit up on top of that, and when that's sitting right, that will just slide through. And so using this jig, I didn't need to change the depth of the saw or anything. I just set these up. I could use the blade at full depth, but it would only cut the bit I want. So let's have a closer look at the jig and how I've put it together. Alright, so starting from the bottom, I've just used basically these 4 pieces of timber screwed together to create a bit of a base for it. And the bottom 2 are just to give it a flat surface like to sit on. So yeah, 70 by 35 framing timber I used, and this is roughly about 300mm or a foot long, just to give you a guide of how big I made it. And realistically, it's all the sort of size that you need. The 2 bases, just so that it's stable to sit on the ground. These 2 here, the rail actually slides in and sits on these, so they need to be close enough together so that when it sits in here, that's actually what supports the top rail. I've spaced them about 75mm apart, but realistically you just need to work out what size post you're going to have sliding in there and what's a good way to support it. And so they're just screwed together. I didn't even glue them, just a couple of screws down and into it to hold that together. After that, I put these two side rails on, side pieces, and what they were for was basically just to raise this up, because I wanted to have this piece for my saw to sit on and an edge as well here. So it had to be just big enough to obviously slide your post under. So with what I've got here, I actually had to use a couple of pieces of 90 by 35 timber. Everything I used to make this was stuff, just offcuts that I had lying around. So you don't have to use these sizes, but it's what I used and what fit. And that's why 90 by 35, you need enough obviously height to fit over your post. I've screwed those from the bottom up just so that the screws were out the way as well. Kept them as far as wide as possible, again just to give me a bit more room and everything. On the top here, these are just a couple of pieces of ply that I had, again basically just offcuts, but you just need to have a flat piece of surface here. But the thing to remember is that when your saw runs along the top here, you need to be able to have enough space or enough depth on your saw blade to cut the depth you need. So like I said, I just kept putting pieces on and measuring. So I use 4mm ply for the top piece, and the same for this straight edge is 4mm ply, but I have two little spacers underneath that just to raise this up enough so that obviously it's high enough for the edge of the saw to run along. Now these cutouts of this 90mm, I actually had left this full size initially and just kept measuring off to get my 50mm back, and then ultimately I used my saw just to cut this along, and that's what cut these pieces of timber out. So you don't have to measure out anything here, just running your saw along this edge, and so it cuts this, was what gave me my straight cut off edge point here. So what that does is that does this vertical cut straight across here. Now to do the horizontal cut, which you've got to be very careful. So this is the way I did it, but using your saw to cut this, it's a bit challenging. So if you're doing it, be very, very careful. And the reason I say that is that you're ultimately, what I was doing was running this edge here of the saw on this flat edge here, and so you only have a very small amount to hold that vertical. So the blade, if you're not careful, could either dig way down deeper or come up a bit. But what I found is standing over the saw to do this cut and then to lay it down and do this cut, I could keep it pretty well flat. And so most of mine I was really happy with. There was a few that was a little bit iffy, but that's okay. I can handle the odd one. So to do that horizontal cut, what I had to do was just work out again some spacings and everything. So I put an end piece on first so that when the timber would slide in here, it would have a stop to sit at. And ultimately what I've got here is two pieces of that 4mm ply screwed together as my stopper, and also then as the flat edge for the saw to run along. And then I've just got another piece of timber at the front here as the edge for that to run along. And so these measurements here were based on what the depth of your blade is, or the size of your blade, the depth of that cut. And so for me, using these two 4mm pieces of ply, and then this just as a flat edge, was enough to space this then at the correct, so that I would take 50mm off here and 50mm off here. There was a fair bit of trial and error of me screwing different things in and measuring that, But with these pieces of timber that I've talked about in the sizes, then for me it's worked really well. So what I did, I'll just go over it quickly again. These are 70 by 35 millimeter timbers. This is spaced 75 millimeters apart. These two verticals, they're 90 millimeters high by 30 mil. I've just screwed them up from underneath. On the top here we have pieces of ply, 4 millimeter ply, and I've got two little spaces under here as well that are both 4 millimeters as well. And then along the front here we have two 4 millimeter pieces of ply and just a piece of pine that I made sure was nice and flat, because obviously that's what is going to cut the horizontal cut, and you want that to be straight as well. So that is the jig I made. I would always use it on the ground. If you've watched any of my fencing videos, you'll see when I'm using this, just cut it on the ground, standing over it. It works quite well. The only real thing to remember, and I never did it really badly, but it's an easy trap that you could forget about, is when you cut one side like this and then you spin it around to cut the other side, make sure that this is sitting perfectly level as well up the other end. So when you're cutting the next side, because if this is sitting like that and the other end you slide in here, then obviously it's not going to sit flat on your other two posts. That was all I did to build this jig. So it was just a lot of measuring and just thinking about what I wanted it to do so that I could replicate this cut over and over again. So I'd had a couple of inquiries about how to build this jig. So I hope this has helped and given information and shown you how I built it. If you're using different size posts and rails, then you'll need to change these sizes and the spacings a little bit more. Probably slightly would need to be taller, probably a little bit wider, that sort of thing. But for a 100 mil post, this is what I've used for these. I hope you found that helpful, and thank you so much for watching. Hey, please hit that like and subscribe button for me. That would be fantastic, and we'll catch you next time. God bless.